Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the July New Yorkers for Clean Power teach-in. Our topic today is gas planning. Let's get it right. And we have a really great lineup of speakers for you today. My name is Lisa Marshall. I'm the Director of Organizing and Advocacy here at New Yorkers for Clean Power. And we host regular teach-ins, usually about once a month, often on topics related to building decarbonization, but also other climate and energy topics. And we're very happy to see so many people on the Zoom today. And thanks for joining us. So today we have a really, let's go back one. I'm really excited about our speaker lineup today. We have with us Meagan Burton, Senior Attorney at Earthjustice, followed by Kristina Persaud, Senior Principal at Advanced Energy United, and last but certainly not least, Josh Berman, Senior Attorney at the Sierra Club. And they are going to walk us through gas planning. Megan's going to kick us off with explaining the origin of this gas planning proceeding and what has happened historically. Kristina is going to tell you about a really interesting study that Advanced Energy United commissioned that shows how much money we could be saving if we were doing integrated planning between gas and electric utilities. And then Josh is going to finish us out with talking about what we want to see in gas planning proceeding going forward. Then we're going to take action together and we'll have time for your questions at the end. Please feel free to type questions into the chat as we go along. And this recording and the slides will all be sent out to everybody who registered for the teach-in after the fact. It takes us a couple of days to get it out to you, but it will be available shortly. So with that said, let me just introduce this topic before turning it over to Megan. Next slide, please. Okay, remember this guy, Governor Cuomo? It's been a while. Cast your mind back to a very exciting year for New York's climate and energy, which was 2019. So you may or may not remember that in May of 2019, Governor Cuomo denied for the first time the water quality permit for the Nessie fracked gas pipeline. And that was a very exciting day for our movement and all of the advocates, many of you, I'm sure, on this call who fought that gas pipeline coming into New York. That same month, the utility National Grid downstate retaliated against this decision by declaring a gas moratorium on Long Island and some parts of New York City. And this kicked off quite the public sort of a fight between the governor of New York and the gas utility. And Cuomo very angrily and forcefully told National Grid that if they were going to threaten customers, they were going to lose their license to operate in New York, which was pretty exciting. Meanwhile, that same summer, Cuomo signed into law the CLCPA, our landmark climate law, and that kicked off a process of really thinking about how we were going to reduce emissions in all sectors, including from the gas system. So that was a pretty interesting and exciting time. And in response to all of that, the Public Service Commission, who are the regulators who regulate the utilities, launched what they called the gas planning proceeding. That's how the PSC makes policy. Instead of the legislature making a law, the utility regulators have proceedings and people put filings in the proceedings, and there's a lot of back and forth, and it ends with an order. And an order is binding. The utilities have to follow the orders of the Public Service Commission. So this happened in March of 2020 in response to the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act being passed and the back and forth about the Nessie pipeline and the National Grid downstate's set-in moratorium, which they clearly used as a threat. And that kicked off a process that Renewable Heat Now campaign and New Yorkers for Clean Power and all the orgs who are presenting to you today have been involved in ever since. And so I won't say more about that because our other presenters are going to tell you what happened. But I will just say I realized today that we had a teach-in March of 2020 on gas planning, and the presenter was Radina Volova, who is now on the PSC. She's one of the commissioners. So that's how long we've all been in the soup, as it were, on gas planning and trying to figure out how we can plan better, smarter, more transparently to make sure everybody has the right energy services provided in a safe, reliable, affordable way, and that we reduce emissions from the gas sector. So with that said, I'm very happy to introduce Meagan Burton, who's going to talk us through what has been happening ever since this all kicked off in that exciting time in 2019 and early 2020. Meagan, welcome and take it away.
Hey everyone, and thank you, Lisa, and thank you, New Yorkers for Clean Power, for inviting me. My name is Meagan Burton, and I'm a senior attorney with Earthjustice, and I've been engaged in the gas planning utility world for some time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the origins of the gas planning and the long-term plans, what some of the orders have said, and then where we are now, and some of the things that have worked and some of the things that have not worked. So we can go to the next slide. So, as Lisa just explained, the New York Public Service Commission really launched and created and initiated a gas planning proceeding in 2020. And there were a lot of things happening politically around that time, particularly around National Grid, as well as the passage of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. But there were a lot of other things that were going on in the background. And when the PSC, initiated this proceeding, there were a number of points that the commission wanted to touch. It seemed like our takeaways was that the PSC was really concerned about either the lack of clear communication with customers by utilities in a way that would really promote some clear and effective customer planning in a way that could reduce confusion, that could encourage emission savings and emissions reductions, and that could also, and that communication would also lead to a manner or a way that would avoid any inequities of investments in certain communities or even the appearance of inequities. And all that's to say, we really believe that the commission really wanted to ensure that there was more transparency in the gas system planning. Like, where were the investments going? Why were they happening? Have the utilities actually show their work and really explain to stakeholders as well as the commission that they've thought this out and that these $100 million investments were necessary in order to ensure that all customers would receive safe and reliable service. The commission also wanted to really ensure that there would be no more moratoriums in the state. And that's exactly what happened that year prior with National Grid and the Nessie pipeline, once that was denied. And so that should never happen. And so as a result, that's another reason why this gas planning proceeding was initiated. And the commission also wanted to ensure that there was going to be, did the utilities have a clear vision as to what a managed downsizing of the gas system would look like? And I'll explain a little bit more of that shortly. And then last, we want to make sure that this gas planning proceeding would comply with the New York's CLCPA, the climate law, particularly around Section 7.2, which revolves around emissions reductions, and 7.3, which addresses investments and avoiding disproportionate burdens in disadvantaged communities. Next slide. And so these are just some of the other, here's an image just to kind of highlight and show folks as to these are all of the moving pieces that need to be discussed in any type of local distribution company, a utility in New York, and what that planning needs to look like today. And these are the pieces that need to work together to kind of build and map out this puzzle that we are currently facing. Next slide. So in its initiating order, I tried to put out some bullet points as to like what the or what the Public Service Commission was requesting and laying out what their vision was. And so they really wanted to have the utilities identify and lay out and explain any type of constraint analysis that are happening in the system. So, are there aging infrastructure? Are there capacity issues? Are there areas where there are reliability issues because certain communities or neighborhoods were not receiving sufficient gas? And why is that? And how was the utility going to resolve that issue? And what was the method and what was the analysis that the utilities plan to use and make that information publicly available to stakeholders? The commission really wants to have some type of like clear guidelines and criteria around non-pipeline solutions. So this also includes like temporary supply. This could include low carbon fuels such as renewable natural gas or compressed natural gas. What does energy efficiency and electrification demand response look like? How are the utilities utilizing those available technologies? And what is the cost recovery going to look like? Establish criteria for reliance on peaker services. And this is also with more delivered fuels. Like, how are the utilities relying on this information and planning for it? And what is the price structure of that? And is there sufficient delivered fuels available? And then also determining some clear standards for governing moratoriums, if there are any. What are the guidelines? What is the planning process? How quickly and efficiently are the utilities going to address that? And then having utilities institute a clear method for demand response as well as new emerging rate designs. And then last, create clear criteria for pollutant reductions. And this is particularly around some additional like delivered fuels like oil and propane. What are those? How are we measuring those? Pollutants and how are we reducing them and transitioning those folks off of delivered fuels onto hopefully some renewable energy sources that could lead to the downsizing of the gas system. Next slide. And then this is just a screenshot that I wanted to highlight that the commission also initiated this proceeding because they really wanted the proceeding to be consistent with the CLCPA and to combat climate change. And that was a clear and huge factor of this gas planning proceeding. So it wasn't strictly to ensure transparency, it wasn't strictly to address moratorium, but also to combat climate change, to downsize the system and transition folks off of the gas system and onto renewable energy sources or electrification. Next slide. So after the initiating order went out in 2020, stakeholders and utilities all had opportunities to submit a number of comments as to how they felt like the utility, what things should be included in the order, what the commission may have missed, and what should be included in the planning process. So in 2022, the commission adopted a gas planning process. And so the commission established a cadence for utility filings so that every 3 years, a utility and they laid out the dates as to when each utility would be required to submit its filing of its long-term plan, which would happen every 3 years. And they needed, and included in that plan, there needed to be a 20-year forecast on both supply and demand. The commission also laid out that there would be an independent third-party consultant that would help facilitate all of the meetings with utilities and stakeholders and would be a huge support for DPS, for the Department of Public Service. The PSC also really encouraged stakeholder participation and also identified that annual reports would need to be filed by all of the utilities about their long-term plan. Next slide. So these are some of the requirements that I pulled out. I felt like the ones that were most prevalent to this conversation of what the commission was really looking for in this long-term plan. And so again, 20-year demand and supply forecasts, clear reliability standards, propose solutions for meeting any type of supply or demand constraints, particularly around non-pipeline alternatives, and also ensuring that there's in these plans that utilities are not just pursuing business as usual, but what are some of the no infrastructure plans or options? Like we don't just need to continue building and building. What are some of the options that we can meet demand and that we can ensure that customers are receiving safe and reliable service without expanding the infrastructure? And then in order to do that, what is the criteria and what does that framework look like? What do the utilities need to look at? What types of benefit cost analysis need to be included? Is there additional funding that can be layered in order to like build out those non-pipeline alternatives? Um, and last, wanting to ensure that there are clear compliance with the CLCPA. And those are some of the points that I laid out before around 7.2 and 7.3 with emissions reductions, as well as prioritizing and avoiding disproportionate impacts or disproportionate burdens in disadvantaged communities. Next slide. So the first utility that that started or kicked off this planning process in the planning proceeding was National Fuel. And National Fuel is out in Western New York. It is a vertically integrated gas-only utility. And when we say vertically integrated, it means that they own and run gas interstate pipelines, as well as are the local distribution company serving customers in its service territory. There was 3 rounds of their long-term plan, and in there, like as stakeholders, from environmental organizations, we were disappointed with their plan. We didn't feel like it was ambitious, it was creative, it was actually taking to heart some of the things that were laid out by the PSC, and we didn't see any meaningful change. We really felt like the plan was very much business as usual. In their plan, they laid out that they didn't believe that any customers would be exiting or leaving the gas system, or that they would be decommissioning or downsizing the gas system. They made assumptions that any customer that did transition to electrification would need to retain gas as a backup system. They also questioned whether cold climate heat pumps could actually serve customers in their service territory and whether that technology existed or would exist in the future. There were also inconsistent or not clear assumptions around the price of electricity versus the price of gas and what would be the best option for customers. And there was very minimal emissions reductions that were attributed to such fuels as renewable natural gas or hydrogen blending, and that they were like overly assuming that that these fuels would be available. And there was really very little information around disadvantaged communities. And what was very like enlightening about this planning process with National Fuel is that almost all of the stakeholders, as well as the independent consultants, really recommended at the time for the PSC to deny this long-term plan because it was inconsistent with the orders and the directions that the Public Service Commission laid out. Unfortunately, the PSC failed to really approve or deny the long-term plan. And as such, we are left with like, what does the language of this order actually really mean? They just really requested the utility to further explore and plan and take additional things into consideration when they submit their next plan in the next 3 years, which was very disappointing. Next slide. You can keep going, Jen. And so just really like where we are today, every utility, and you can continue going, Jen, as I'm speaking, every utility has completed its first version of its long-term plan. And the commission has really like issued inconsistent orders on all of those plans. There was real meaningful engagement by stakeholders, as well as Enviro's renewable energy folks. But we don't have any clear vision as to what the planning actually means or what's resulting from that. The commission has yet to resolve or answer real substantive questions that it laid out in its initiating order around alternative fuels, benefit cost analysis, non-pipeline alternatives, which makes it very difficult and challenging for us to engage in the next long-term plan. Next slide. And then here are some additional challenges that we face, that there is like some clear like lack of coordination with the rate cases in these PSC long-term plans. The plans are laid out, but then how is it the costs for these plans actually addressed? And as I said, there's also inconsistent commission orders, lack of compliance with the CLCPA, and then last, really what Kristina will kind of touch on is that there's no clear integrated planning between electric utilities and gas utilities to make sure that we are making the most smart and strategic investments and that we're not investing in like dual capital expenditures. And so we want to ensure that we're complying with the CLCPA, doing it in the most cost-effective way, and ensuring that all customers have safe and reliable service. So I will hand it over to Kristina. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you for that background in planning, Megan. Um, so clearly there's some issues in the way in which we're planning our systems, but we're in a new day and it's clear that we need a new and much smarter alternative for how we plan our energy systems and across those two systems holistically. But we can go to the next slide. Before I dive deeply into some wonky stuff, I'm just going to give you some background. Advanced Energy United's a national association of businesses dedicated to a 100% clean future. And in my role, I focus on everything touching New York State. So we can go ahead to the next slide. We go ahead and bucket our work into three buckets, build it. We want it to be affordable, and we want to build things that are flexible to make sure that we're building the grid of tomorrow, not hardening outdated old technologies. So you can go to the next slide. Today, we're going to be focusing on building it. What are we building? How much of it do we need to build? And what do we not need to build? To ensure we're really optimizing our spending. So, by way of background, how our energy system is being planned is a way that's a little bit old. And that was fine at one point in time. Historically, systems were planned in complete isolation of each other. So the gas systems were planned in a dual fuel utility like National Grid, completely separately from what their electric arm was doing. And that made sense. When your furnace broke, you weren't given the option of getting a heat pump. When your hot water heater broke, you weren't given that option. So your gas was your gas and your heat was your heat. And electric utilities handled these things in complete isolation of each other and then brought these things to the Public Service Commission where they were reviewed in complete isolation. And at a time that did make sense because there was no interplay between those two systems. However, today's energy realities are very different. New Yorkers are electrifying very quickly, and that can mean a variety of things. This could be moving away from appliances that had been powered by gas, like home heating, your hot water system, your stoves, even your dryers can now be heat pumps or electric based. This is something that the state utilities, municipal governances are supportive of. However, the way we plan for it has never evolved. So now we know there are these interfaces between the two systems. There are tools that have been developed to help see how these systems are playing together, but our utilities have not yet adopted it. So big picture, New York's at this critical juncture in the energy transition. New Yorkers are charging ahead with electrification. However, our utility planning processes have not evolved to meet that. The conflict is when utilities plan their systems and when our regulators review them, they're looking at them in a completely isolated way that does create this loophole that would allow for utilities to charge customers twice for the infrastructure. This lack of coordination leads to duplicative spending. It creates risks of stranded infrastructure, of stranded assets, and ratepayers are the ones who will end up getting stuck with these bills for decades to come. Put another way, if we don't get our spending right today, our children will be paying those bills because that's how large these investments are and how important it is that we get our investments correct. So we move on to the next slide, which shows my point. This is the sale of electric heat pump furnaces versus gas furnaces. Since 2021, the heat pump furnaces have outsold the older gas furnaces, which goes to my point of, for whatever reason, consumer choice is to electrify. This could be folks are very in tune to decarbonization. Also, it could be a health choice, it could be affordability choice. I know for me, something that gives me heartburn is explosions. Every single year, I see these news broadcasts about a family's home that exploded because of a gas leak. I remember when a church exploded due to a gas leak, and it's both deeply saddening and terrifying. So, for whatever reason, folks are choosing to electrify. And we can move on to the next slide, which gets into the real world implication. There was a study conducted by Current Energy Group that I'll share with you all. I'll drop the link in the chat when I'm done speaking, that looks at National Grid's upstate territory and the assumption that the electric side makes versus the gas side. On this slide, we see National Grid assumes a very steep increase in heat pump adoption, and that blue line at the bottom shows a very nominal gas line. And this can be used to justify the need to build out the electric system. Consumers are electrifying, and we need to meet that need and ensure the power there is adequate. However, we're going to move to the next slide that uncovers a staggering disconnect in the gas case. The line that's increasing in the gas case is an increase in gas and actually a decrease in electric. Both of these things cannot be accurate at the same time. And even though they cannot be accurate at the same time, it is being used to justify National Grid spending an extra $550 million by 2029 in this one area to build out the gas system. Clearly, there's a contradiction here. The gas growth forecasts electrification stagnation that we know to be inaccurate. Meanwhile, that same utility is projecting an electric increase due to the rapid heat pump adoption. The reality check here is if the gas side had planned alongside the electric side, they would have projected 15,000 fewer gas customers, a drop of 3%, by just 2029, and just in this one area alone. We didn't do wider studies to find what else is going around the state, but in just this one area, $550 million by 2029. So the problem is clear here. These forecasts and assumptions cannot be accurate, and that is leading to overbuilding infrastructure we may not need and overspending. And that overspending is being borne by ratepayers. I'm not the only one who gets staggering energy bills at a time when all of our other bills are growing up as well. So on the next slide, we'll talk about potential solutions to that problem. And that is integrated energy planning, which sounds a little bit like a mouthful. But as you remember on the first slide, we talked about basically at utilities, the left hand is not required to know what the right hand is doing. Integrated energy planning would resolve that. It's a process of coordinating across the gas and electric systems into one holistic energy and utility planning framework. Why this is important? At its core, integrated energy planning prevents utilities from overbuilding the energy infrastructure system with customer dollars. Here comes a really frustrating part. When can we get integrated energy planning? The Public Service Commission has the authority to implement integrated energy planning right now. They can require that utilities use analytical practices and processes to align gas and electric decisions around shared forecasts, risks, and customer outcomes. There is already existing software that would empower them to do this. However, to date, they have not used this power. At United, we are not going to be deterred. We continue to push this regulatorily. However, we have also started to push this in the form of legislation to create statute that would require the Public Service Commission to change the protocols for utility companies. So we can go ahead to the next slide. To New York's credit, I think New York recognizes the importance of integrated energy planning. They recognize the benefits of integrated energy planning, and they also recognize that there is a projected decline in gas system utilization in their state energy plan, in multiple places in the state energy plan in 2025. They did state the value of integrated energy planning. However, again, to date, they have not taken any action to further integrated energy planning in the state. This is at a time when New Yorkers are facing skyrocketing energy bills, and we just cannot let utilities overbuild things that are unnecessary. This is a time when we need regulators to mandate strict and integrated energy planning to protect consumers, make sure our grid is adequate and resilient, and to also pursue our clean energy mandates that are already in statute that Lisa covered at the top of the call. So now I'll hand it over to Josh, who's going to go a little bit further into the state energy plan.
Thanks so much, Kristina. And thank you, Lisa, and New Yorkers for Clean Power. So I'm Josh Berman. I'm an attorney with the law program at the Sierra Club. I can go on to the next slide. So Sierra Club, along with a lot of other folks on this call and other presenters, has been engaged deeply in all of the gas utility long-term planning dockets to date. And as Meagan shared, I think the first round of plans, there are 11 gas utilities in New York. We completed the first round of plans recently. The first round of plans really kind of fell flat. We did not see the type of clear, decisive action to enable the type of efficient cost savings that Kristina was highlighting through that first set of plans. So I'm going to take stock of the developments since the end of the last round of plans and then talk about what we're hoping to see going forward. So we can go to the next slide. So I wanted to flag two recent developments, the first of which Kristina already teed up, which was that the state, after 10 years of not updating its state energy plan in December, the state, for the first time, finalized a new state energy plan. It is, I think for those who worked closely on trying to influence it and improve it, it is a deeply disappointing document. That being said, it has several recommendations that are important to the gas planning process and that I wanted to highlight. One of the rare points of decisiveness in the state energy plan, in rare concrete recommendations, the state has said that blending hydrogen into existing natural gas pipeline infrastructure is untenable due to safety, integrity, and indoor air quality problems. This is a reality that the advocates have been pointing out in all of the individual gas utility long-term plan dockets and had been picked up by the independent consultants. And unfortunately, the commission previously had not acknowledge this reality. So the fact that the state energy plan recognizes that blending hydrogen is not part of the future of the gas system in New York is fantastic. Um, Another potentially helpful aspect of the final state energy plan is that it directs gas utility long-term plans to identify areas where the gas system will be necessary in the long term and prioritize investment in those areas over others. Um, I think there's a sort of like unstated potential second half of this sentence that a lot of advocates like myself are trying to read into it, which is that we should look then for the areas that we don't need for the long term to actually start shrinking the gas system. I wish the state energy plan had come out and said that more directly, but I think that hopefully is implicit in the way this is written. So that is really helpful for future gas planning. And then finally, the state energy plan directs the Public Service Commission to advance integrated gas electric planning to optimize energy system investments. This is exactly what Kristina was talking about. It doesn't exist yet, but it at least is teed up in a helpful way in the state energy plan. And one of our goals and one of our roles as advocates is going to be to try to make sure that that actually happens in the near term and in a meaningful way. The other development I wanted to flag is, unfortunately, the most recent state budget, which, although 2 months late, was quite consequential. Many bad things in it, but the most problematic for our purposes with gas planning is that the final budget made changes to the climate law that affect how New York accounts for the greenhouse gas emissions associated with certain pollutants. Um, Notably, New York switched from being a sort of at the vanguard by using what was called a global warming potential of 20 years, so looking at how greenhouse gases impact climate forcing over a 20-year period, to using a 100-year period, which has major consequences for resources that leak or emit methane, including our gas system. So methane on a 20-year time frame is, many times more carbon forcing or greenhouse gas forcing than it is climate forcing, apologies, than it is on a 100-year time frame. So switching from the 20-year to the 100-year, it takes a lot of pressure off of gas utilities, which are major emitters of methane. And then secondly, the accounting for biogenic carbon dioxide emissions was changed. They are now no longer going to be part of New York's climate inventory that it uses for determining compliance with the climate requirements of the CLCPA. As a consequence, this makes renewable natural gas, and I'll put renewable in quotes, renewable natural gas, appear to be a zero emission resource. So that has big consequences as well for gas planning. Let's go to the next slide. Um, we are we are now, many months after the last gas utility long-term plan, and had been kind of eager for this next round of planning to have been moving forward. It is not yet. So one of the things that we're really hoping to do with galvanizing folks on this webinar is to encourage folks to really push the commission to make this process move forward. We really need more clarity. Department of Public Service staff, to their credit, reached out to a number of the advocates who had been involved in the first round of planning. Meagan and I had a meeting with a number of folks from staff back in January. At the time, we were told that staff was planning to put out a white paper with recommended revamping of the gas planning process by late February. That then slipped to June, and most recently, the intel is late summer or early fall. So we really need to keep some pressure on them to move this process forward. Meanwhile, in February, a number of our groups submitted a letter detailing our recommendations for how this should work to the commission and submitted it in the gas planning docket. Let's go on to the next slide. So as Meagan teed up, there were a lot of things that were left unresolved by that first round of 3-year gas utility long-term plans. When I enumerate these, you will, I guess, probably share my sense that it is pretty much every important issue that was left unresolved, but I will nonetheless tick them off for us. Maybe most fundamentally, the amount and timing of greenhouse gas emission reductions that the gas sector and individual gas utilities are supposed to achieve, totally unresolved by the first round of planning. The role for alternative combustion fuels, and that is kind of a euphemism for this RNG and hydrogen, in a decarbonized system, was left largely or completely unresolved. The context for replacement versus repair or relining of pipes as the system transition was left around. This is incredibly consequential. There are thousands of miles of pipes that were installed decades ago and use materials that we now consider to be leak prone. The gas utilities would love to systematically replace all of those pipes, and the cost of doing that is going to be in the tens to hundreds of billions of dollars. Um, we don't necessarily need to do that if, in fact, those pipes are not going to then be around for, many, many decades. If there are actual leaks, there are less costly ways of repairing the pipes. And if we think that the system is not going to be needed for the long term, we could potentially retire some of those pipes and not replace them at all. That's left again unresolved. The role for hybrid heating systems. So as Meagan flagged, National Fuel Gas wants everyone to have a hybrid system. They say heat pumps can't provide adequate heating in New York. Therefore, everyone should retain gas backup and actually mostly use gas for their heating needs. So the commission, this issue has been teed up in all the individual gas utility long-term plans for the commission. No resolution. The criteria for evaluating non-pipe alternatives. So one of the best things that we can do right now is to, instead of making further capital investments in the gas system, we can do what are called non-pipe alternatives. So that could look like getting people on a certain section of the gas pipeline to electrify. If they do that, then we don't need to invest in replacing that set of pipes. The commission has yet to clarify what criteria should exist around NPAs. And then finally, depreciation schedules. And this sounds a little wonky, but right now, if a gas utility invests in a new pipe, that pipe, they will typically recover that cost over 6 to 8 decades, possibly even more. And they will recover it in a linear basis. So they'll basically recover a equal increment of the cost over all 6 or 8 decades. Unfortunately, well, the number of customers who are going to likely be on the gas system is going to decline over time. So what that means, if you're recovering the cost linearly, is that the folks who are still on the system after 30 years are going to be paying a much larger share of that cost, because a lot of the other people who would have been sharing that cost burden are likely to have migrated to the electric system. This is not equitable. And so one of the things that we've been advocating for is trying to ensure that we are modernizing our depreciation schedules so that we're actually depreciating things more consistent with the way those resources are used. So if the pipe is going to see most of its throughput in the first few years, more of the cost should be paid by people who are using it in the first few years. Let's go on to the next slide. So what we pushed for in our February letter, and we would encourage us all to continue to push for, we want some of these major unresolved issues to be addressed by the commission in the current generic gas planning docket. That's the one that applies to all the utilities, before we dive back into the next round of individual gas planning dockets. We're very concerned that because these issues need to have a common resolution across all the gas utilities, it doesn't make a lot of sense to be fighting them out in each individual gas utility docket and then having the commission throw up its hands and not make a decision. So one of our big pushes is to actually prioritize resolving some of these key cross-cutting issues now before we go into that next round of planning. All right, I won't enumerate them all again. We can go to the next slide. In the individual gas dockets, what we really think should be happening, and this is consistent with what I flagged was in the state energy plan, we should really be looking at, for an individual gas utility basis, what are the parts of the system that we are going to need for the long term, and what are the parts of the system that we don't, so that the gas utility can be identifying and planning for the phasing out of the pieces of the system that we don't need for the long term, and they can be prioritizing their investments in the pieces of the system that do, so that we're not investing equally in all pieces of the system. And this again is completely consistent with what Kristina presented. We also want to make sure, and this is a big piece that Meagan flagged, we want to make sure that whatever is happening in these gas utility long-term plans is actually feeding into the utility rate cases. So if the gas utilities in their plans say, oh, well, we don't need to make any of these investments because we're going to electrify all these customers, and then they turn around and go into the rate case and say, actually, we want to make all these investments, and that's where the rate case is where the rubber meets the road, in the sense that that's where they actually get authorization to recover the cost of making those expenditures. So it's very, very important that we have a much clearer connection between what's happening in the gas planning cases and what the utilities are actually submitting in the rate cases. And then just in the utility rate cases, we want the rate cases to be the place where there is actual review and approval of specific utility investments. The gas planning dockets are not really designed for that. We should be identifying at a higher level where those investments make sense, but then the actual prudence determination should happen in the rate case with all the safeguards that come with a rate case. Let's go to the next slide. All right. And why do we care about all this? Well, if we do this all better than we have been doing it, there are a lot of potential benefits. Many of them are on the cost side. If we do smarter integrating of gas and electric planning, we can avoid redundant investments into systems. If we clarify the rule for repair and relining, we can avoid paying the full cost of replacing pipes, which is orders of magnitude more than repair. If we oh, I didn't even get into this, but yeah, the utilities all have their own methodologies for how they calculate how much throughput there's going to be on the highest day of their, like the worst winter day of their system. Some of them look back 130 years, some of them look back 40 years, some of them account for climate change and how that's going to affect it, some of them don't. That clearly needs to be standardized. If we standardize that, we can also further help overbuilding our system. If we need to clarify the role for these so-called alternative low carbon fuels, RNG and hydrogen, so we can avoid unstrategic investment in those fuels. And we need to modernize depreciation schedules so that we can avoid future gas customers bearing an undue share of the costs. If we do all this, we can also get enormous emission benefits. We get clear greenhouse, if we have greenhouse gas emission targets, the gas utilities have to plan towards those. They're going to be held accountable. If we fix leaks rather than just simply replacing on an ad hoc basis or on a the uniform basis all quote unquote leak prone pipes, we can save we can reduce emissions and save a lot of money. And then we also really need to clarify the role for gas planning and reducing disproportionate burdens on disadvantaged communities. All right, I think that's my last slide.
Looking into the future. So could I just ask for a last round of applause for our wonderful speakers? I know I've been engaged in this for a long time and I learned a lot today. And thank you all so much for joining us at this lunchtime